Now, rubber molds. Any non-rigid mold is referred to as a rubber mold. It can be made of silicone, it can be latex, it can be any kind of rubber, really. And it's still called a rubber mold. That's how people are gonna call it. Don't go correcting them. And they are much more expensive to produce than rigid molds. But first of all, they're easier to do. Second of all, because you can just pull things open, you don't need nearly as many... Apologies, that was puppies barking. Not really puppies, I just call them that. Because I can just pull things open, I don't have to design my molds quite so well. It's easier. But the most important things, I get to use fewer parts in the molds, and each place where halves meet is going to be a seam line. So the fewer parts, the better for you. You obviously don't want whatever you're making to be covered with seam lines all over. And another thing is, because they are flexible, they also last longer. They're not so easy to destroy accidentally. They're not gonna just crumble. So yeah, basically, aside from the cost, that's all positives. Another thing, single part mold. A single part mold is what it says on the label. It's a mold made with only a single part. And there are very few objects that can be reproduced with a single part mold. And typically, a single part mold is going to be an open mold. Now, this is 1/2 of a closed mold, but, you know, let's pretend there was never supposed to be a second part. So this will give you a half sphere with a hole inside, basically. Now, what happens in an open mold is that obviously you don't need venting or sprues, because you're just pouring resin into here like you would into a bowl or something. But this side of the object obviously doesn't get reproduced, and you will just have a flat surface there. It's mostly used for by people who make jewelry, some sort of pendants or cabochons, whatever, just stuff that has a flat back. And also a single part mold, if your object is even a little bit more complicated, like if this was a rose instead of just a half sphere, it gets difficult to remove the object, so either you're going to destroy the mold very quickly or it's not going to work at all. So, what most objects can be copied with are multi-part molds, and as long as there's more than one part, it's a multi-part mold. That's what it's called, and that's it. Now, if you want to be more specific, you just put the number of parts there. It's a 2-part mold, which is the most commonly used, but there are also 3, 4, 6-part molds. And basically that's all you need to know about that. Now, a glove mold is any mold in which the object is surrounded by silicone or other molding compound from all the sides except for one. So basically it's like a hand in a glove. There's silicone all over except for this side. So you would just pull it off the object, and that's a glove mold. A core mold, Now one more thing, the glove part is one piece. The mold itself, the whole thing, can have other parts as well, but the glove, in order to be called a glove mold, is one thing, just one part. A core mold is any mold in which there is silicone inside the object. Now we'll use Yoji's chest for demonstrating that, as long as he can separate from his tummy. Okay, here it is. This would use a core mold to reproduce, because there would be resin in here, inside. That would be called the core. Most often, if there are 2 or 3 part molds, a core mold can be also a glove mold, in which case there will be the core and the outside. Or it can be a 3-part mold, where there's the core, the front, and the back. That would create additional seam lines here, here, and here. But at the same time, it would be much easier to remove from the mold, so the mold would have a much longer life. And it would also allow this whole thing to be more detailed, because otherwise, if this was all one part, it would be very difficult to take off. Another thing is a mother mold. A mother mold is any mold that has a rigid shell around it. There are many reasons why you would do that. First of all, having a rigid shell over the mold protects it from warping. Now, if I, during casting, for example, bound this too tight, there would be some warping. As you can see, the shape on the inside will be different. Now I will show you an extreme example of warping. This is my warped piece. This, in theory, this should be a perfect sphere. So you can see there's extreme, and I mean extreme, warping. So yeah, that's what it looks like. Obviously you want to avoid that, so having a rigid shell around it would prevent the mold from shifting and warping. And another reason is when you have a mother mold, then the mold itself doesn't have to be so thick, and that saves costs. On the other hand, it usually only really works with bigger molds. Smaller ones, not so much, because by the time you make a rigid shell of it, it's just not gonna sit together right. Now, the mother mold, the shell can be made of basically anything that's rigid, but typically it's plaster, fiberglass, or resin. Now, not the polyurethane resin you would pour, but polyester resin, sometimes kinds of epoxy resin. Also, the term mother mold refers to both the whole mold with the shell and the shell itself. Now, flashing. Flashing is the fringe of resin that is left around the object on the seam line, and it's the resin that squeezed between the halves, like here. It just flew into the in between the parts of the mold. And yeah, this thing has most of the flashing removed. There's a little bit here, not much. Oh, this is some good flashing for you. Now, how much flashing there is and how severe it is depends on how well the halves of the mold sit together and how flushly they fit. Now, obviously there are going to be a few factors contributing to that. One of them is how well the mold is made and designed. And the second is the age of the mold, because as it gets used, the parts won't fit just as well as they used to. And another thing is putting the mold together properly, so having proper keys and just not squeezing it too tightly, but also holding it together properly so that the parts don't move around. And seam lines or parting lines are the thin lines of resin that are left after removing the flashing. There's some seam line here. I mean, there's seam lines all over this because it's a miscast, but some still have the flashing and some are just the seam lines and they're super thick. This is a nice, well, more or less nice thin seam line. Still visible on camera, so not so good, but... And it works just like the flashing. The better your mold fits together, the smaller, less noticeable the seam line will be. Okay, so my battery died and I had to start over after a while to recharge the batteries. Anyways, we stopped at mold release. Mold release is a substance that you use in order to make things that would otherwise stick to each other not stick. That's the simple version. A mold release is often wax-based, but there are many other kinds. There are silicone-based mold releases. Different kinds are used for different materials, so make sure you use the appropriate one. Different situations in which you're going to use a mold release. First of all, you're definitely going to need it when you're making a multi-part mold, in which case you will have one part of the mold done and you want to pour the other half. So you will put mold release on the exposed parts of the already made part so that then you can take them apart. Another situation is putting mold release on the master so that it doesn't stick to the silicone while you're creating the mold, and putting mold release on the mold itself before casting so that the cast comes out okay. Now, these two uses are usually unnecessary, but they may extend the life of the mold because, you know, the easier your casts come out, the less pressure that puts on the mold, so it will last you longer. There's also the problem of there being residue from the mold release on casts. I know that that's a thing that happens with some doll companies. That's something to be aware of. It's probably not going to ruin the whole doll. At least I don't think I heard of a situation that was that extreme. But it's still something to have in mind when deciding whether to use a mold release for casting or not. A lot of people just use mold release on everything because I guess they just assume that's how it's done, is just put it on everything. While basically resin and silicone do not and will not stick to each other. I've never used mold release for casting and I've never had a single problem, and my mold life is perfectly fine. I haven't tested long runs, like extremely long runs yet, but so far so good. And I've done things like 15-20 casts from a single mold and no problem whatsoever there. So think about it, make your own decision there. Another thing is there are different kinds of mold releases in terms of how they're used. There are ones in spray cans, there are liquid ones or paste that you brush on. All are different things. Most of the time they're going to be more or less the same, although if you have a brush on one, then it can sometimes make a layer that's too thick or get some shape from the brush strokes on the cast mold, whichever you're using it on. And a great alternative to mold releases that are commercially available is Vaseline. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Vaseline is extremely cheap and works perfectly when you want to release silicone from silicone. And that's pretty much the only use that's actually really necessary, and you can't go without it. Okay, moving on, filler. A filler is generally a substance that is added to something else in order to affect its properties. The difference between filler and other additives is that filler does not react with the silicone or resin. Typically, filler is used for resin because with silicone you want every bit of the properties of silicone for your molds. So typically it's resin. It doesn't react with the resin, it doesn't really become part of it, it just sort of gets trapped in it as it sets. Chemically it's not part of the finished product. Fillers are most commonly used in order to affect the density or weight of the product, and that means you will be using either a very light or a very heavy substance. And another thing is sometimes they can make resin stronger, and finally they can also make things cheaper because they can be mixed in ratios like 3 parts filler to 1 part resin. And that's a lot, and that makes things really cheaper. If you can hear my dog whining in the background, she's just being over dramatic right now. That's how she is. And so yeah, if you want to tell someone whether or not there's filler in the resin, you will call the resin filled or non-filled. And usually products made of non-filled resin, in case of dolls specifically, because all uses are different and there are different properties that you will want from your resin. But when it comes to dolls, typically a non-filled resin or a resin that uses just a little bit of filler will be better quality, and it will be definitely a lot more expensive. Now, mold box. Mold box is any container that is used to make a mold in. The reason you use a mold box is that, well, silicone is liquid, right? So if I just take a part and pour silicone on it, it will just flow all over the place, just like any other liquid would. So you put it in some sort of container so that the silicone fills it and it builds up around the part. The container is always called a mold box, no matter what it is. And really anything can be a mold box as long as it's waterproof. You can make a custom mold box with the kinds of cardboard that will not absorb water. Of course you're not pouring water there, but silicone, and silicone doesn't really go with water so well. But it's sort of the same thing, because you don't want the box to absorb any of the substance. That was dog number 2, I'm sorry. And yeah, you can use something like an old container from ice cream. You can use a glass, a plastic cup, anything. But a sort of professional mold box is just 4 pieces of wood, which have either a hole carved in or a piece attached there that allows you to screw them together. There are many ways to assemble that, but basically that's 4 pieces of wood that you can assemble to form a box that's many different shapes or sizes, so it's perfectly reusable and adjustable to whatever situation you're in and whatever part you're molding. I would show you my mold box. I have a sort of professional-ish one, but it's not assembled, so currently it's just 4 pieces of wood. There's not much to look at, but once I do some molding, I will show you that, show you how it works and how it looks assembled. Okay, another thing is build-up. Build-up is what you call when you put clay around the part for a variety of reasons. It may be generally it's in order to not let silicone get somewhere where you don't want it. It may be because you want to shape the mold. It may be because you want to shut something off, like a hole inside, so that silicone doesn't get in there. It can be when you're making a multi-part mold, so that you decide which will be one part, which will be the other. And it also allows you to register your mold or key it, and that will be in a second, which is right now. Keys, registration keys, registration marks, etc. Are shapes in parts of the mold that make sure that the parts won't slip around, move around, or so. Usually they're holes in one part and sort of pegs in the other. These are the registration marks here. These are the holes. And as I pour silicone into it, I got these pegs things sticking out so that they match. Upside down. And this way I can put my mold back together perfectly, and it won't move around, it won't shift, and it reduces the risk of warping. I don't know why all my pets are being dramatic right now. You may have heard my cat previously also, and I think the rat is also making some sort of noise. So I'm sorry. And that's it. That's it for the list. That's it for the tutorial. I hope it was informative and it helped you somehow. I definitely will be making more soon. I'm back into the swing of things, and if you have any questions, then please contact me. I will be glad to help you. Please check out my Patreon campaign. There will be a link here, and my doll page, which is also here.